Hello, everybody. I am going to be recording this time around the beginning of Unit 2. So everything that we've covered through chapters 1 through 3 is going to be in Unit 1. And then there will be, there may be things I reference or something, but I'm not going to be grading, and there will be no further test assessment over chapters 1 through 3. That's all part of Unit 1, and that kind of closes up. There's not a cumulative final either. So for the next unit, for Unit 2, it's going to cover chapters 4 through 6. And so make sure that those remain focused. Make sure and view the lectures for chapters 4, 5, and 6, read the chapters 4, 5, and 6, and complete the discussions and journals for 4, 5, and 6. And then once 6 is finished, we'll have exam 2, and then, essentially each unit is 3 chapters. So, but this is chapter 4, and there's a little overlap, mainly because a lot of the religions we're going to discuss in chapter 4 actually happened far earlier than even the Roman Empire. And so we'll try to cover it. Some of it will be in order of, which came earliest, though there are a few, if some are connected to each other, sometimes they're right next to each other. And I did try to follow the chapter and the chapter order in this. So we'll be moving back and forth. If there are some pictures or some other detail I want to make sure you read in the chapter, I may go flip back to it, but mostly we'll stay on the PowerPoint. And if you've always wondered about certain religions and you've never had the chance to really look at any of them, this will give you a smattering. But I do warn you that this is really a simplified version. And so don't take it as this is all that Hinduism is, or all that Taoism is, or something like that. It's only going to give you a little brush with kind of the main ideas that are present in each of these faiths. Many of the faiths are going to be polytheistic, so there will be many gods, or at least a few gods in these faiths, but quite a few of them are monotheistic, although far fewer. Monotheism is not nearly as prevalent, especially in the ancient world, as it is, as polytheism is. And even today, there is a very large number of the population of the world that is polytheistic and remains so. So most of these religions still exist. Some of them have, very small numbers, but, others have billions of followers even today. So we'll kind of go through all of that. We won't really cover, just so you know, we won't really cover agnosticism or atheism, essentially a complete lack of any belief in an afterlife or, deities or any sort of supernatural or any of that kind of stuff. But that's because those aren't really religions. They might be turned to philosophies, but agnosticism, all it technically means is don't know, that the person doesn't know what the truth is. Atheism obviously is a denial of any belief at all. So, but we will not be covering those. Although I'm sure even in the ancient world, there were agnostics and there were atheists. So I'm not negating the fact that that exists, and they are certainly present today as well. Now, before we really talk about religion, though, I want to make sure I'm going to use the word myth a lot. You've probably have heard of Greek mythology. You've probably heard people say, well, that's just a myth. And so very often we look at the term myth and think, oh, well, that's an untruth. That's a lie. It's a fictional story. But the truth is myth is not necessarily a denotation of fiction or nonfiction, truth or untruth. Myth is a traditional story that captures a truth, what is deemed to be an inherent truth within a culture or a faith. So, for instance, it's like kind of like a parable. When someone would ask a question of a priest, and he answers in a story. So if there's, if we're asking, like for instance, Jesus, it might be asked a question, and rather than answer outright, he tells a story of the prodigal son or a story of the Good Samaritan. And that is a myth. It's not a real story necessarily. There's no indication of whether it's a true story or untrue story, and yet it tells the truth. So we're not going to delve into which religions are factual or valid, or, you know, in this particular discussion, all religions are valid. And so be really careful too when you go into discussions this semester, this time, that you are respectful of differences. Even within a faith, even by people who share a faith, there are differences of belief, and often they cause a lot of unrest and even violence. This is not what acceptable, certainly for this classroom, but it's not what is the benefit of faith. So be really cautious and be very respectful of each other, because we don't all think alike, nor do we all believe alike. So, but hopefully you'll learn something that will surprise you this time around, even if it's because you knew nothing about a particular faith or had never even heard of it for that matter. So the truth is all faith systems contain myth of some kind, whether it be traditional stories that are told within, you know, of the people who are part of that faith. Things like some of the Greek heroes like Heracles or Pericles, or that type of thing, or figures in other faiths like Samson or Noah, or, you know, or Muhammad, or, yeah, or the prophets who are part of it, you know, Ezra and you know, even Jesus. So all of those, you know, those traditional stories all make up the myth, or what sometimes they'll call it the mythos of a person's faith, and so, or of a culture's faith. So I'm going to cover a lot of the main figures that might come up, or the main tenets of a particular faith, you know, some of the things that kind of are guidelines. If you are going to practice this faith, or the people who do practice that faith, this is what they typically do and what they see as important. This is what they prioritize. This is what they see God to be, or their gods to be. One thing I will too talk, whenever I'm speaking of monotheistic gods, I will usually use a capital, because they have a singular God, whether named or unnamed. And then if I'm talking about polytheistic gods, usually I will use the lowercase gods. So you can see that at the bottom of this line, this screen too. The gods, singular is capitalized, plural is uncapped. So the main thing is that all of these myths, all of these stories, are designed to govern behavior, to explain how the world works, to explain how things happen, to justify particular viewpoints. So they're all meant to give meaning to people within that particular cultural faith. And so that's what but I'm not going to be telling you, if I say the word myth, I'm not saying, oh, this is a fictional story that somebody wrote, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm just saying this is a typical story that is traditionally told and known within that faith. That's all I'm saying. Okay. Now, as far as the world religions, the very earliest ones that we have, you know, at least that we know of historically, because a lot of these are a little iffy on the dates. Hinduism is probably the oldest. Judaism is almost as old, although you look at when they begin. Hinduism began roughly, what, 3,500 years ago. That's a long time. We assume that religion was around far longer than that. But again, we're talking about prehistory. So there may be faiths that were orally passed along for many, many centuries or even millennia before then, but they weren't written down to a way that we can actually say, okay, yeah, around here we definitely had religion. The Judaic texts, for instance, we know were probably passed down orally for centuries and centuries before they were ever actually written down into the early books of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, and those types of things. So those earliest books, you know, those histories were kept orally before they were ever written down. And that's kind of the same for Hinduism and many of these others. Some of them actually don't have, they have a few writers who have published texts that are, but a lot of the guidelines are really pretty vague. And that's one reason why some of these faiths have many different sects. And when I say the word sect, I mean S-E-C-T, sect. And if it's plural, sects, it just has an S at the end. It is not sex, okay? It's not S-E-X. It's always a section, or it's not a denomination. That's not the same thing. But it is essentially one sliver or one aspect or one facet or one grouping of different faiths. And so we'll cover those. Christianity has many of those. Islam has many, although there are three major ones. And Hinduism has many, a lot of them, even Judaism has many. So Buddhism certainly has many. And some of the smaller ones don't have as many, offshoots, but they still have people all practice these things in various ways. So anything that we talk about, they're all going to be, these are all generalizations, and they don't necessarily pertain to all followers or all sects. Okay. So now the monotheistic ones they're roughly five major. That's Judaism, and it's the oldest. Zoroastrianism is somewhat newer. You'll see on this timeline, it's dated at 630 BC. Some date it as early as about 1200 BC, but that's kind of hard. I think it was not named Zoroastrianism until 630 BC because of the priest Zoroaster, after whom it is named. But he kind of encapsulated it into something specific, if that makes sense. Christianity, it says AD, or that's actually CE 30, so about 30 years after, within the Common Era. But even Christianity really didn't get established until about 323 CE, once the Nicene Council met. So, and that actually, it had already fractured into several different sects, and one particular sect took hold, and that was Orthodox Christianity, or as we would put it, Catholicism. So we're going to talk about all of those things as we go, but we'll try to cover them mostly in order. A few we're not going to cover as much, mainly because they will not figure as much in what we're going to study later on. But I wanted you to get a smattering. So if you think religions are interesting, this will be a really cool chapter. And if you don't think they're interesting, well, it'll be over soon. Just do what you can to remember, kind of which one, what the different faiths kind of dealt with. One thing I do want you to understand, though, is even though these are separate faiths, they often have a lot of commonality. And that's certainly one of the things I want you to learn from this chapter. We have, for instance, in Christianity, there's a major flood myth of Noah, but flood myths are very common among a lot of different religions. Most Native American, for instance, if they have creation stories about the creation of the earth, they start with a flood, and then people bring either earth from the moon or something like that, or they pull earth from the bottom of the sea and they create the land masses. And so they start out with a flood, and then it comes up with land. So it's almost like their histories are starting after the flood's over. But even Greek mythology has Pyrrha and Deucalion, and I list them after Noah up here. But Pyrrha and Deucalion were a little couple who were super sweet, and Zeus the chief god and god of the heavens, said, well, these human beings are just too nasty, and we need to just get rid of them all. And there is an actual story in Greek mythology where he floods the whole earth and kills everyone except for Pyrrha and Deucalion, who hop into a boat and get saved. And then once they are set back on land, once the floods die down, they pray to essentially Mother Earth and say, what am I supposed to do now? And they are told, take some of the earth, some of the mud in front of you, and throw it over your shoulder. And they do, and it turns into people, and they repopulate the earth. So of course, it's not nearly as, it doesn't have the same animal collecting and some of the same details that Noah does, and yet it's still of that ilk. It's still following that mythic pattern. Am I going to tell you, whether I believe any of this stuff exists or not? No, it has no bearing. The truth is that all of these different faiths are believed by some, and we just want to be respectful of the fact that, and acknowledge the fact that there are populations all over the world that believe differently, and that's okay. Okay. So many of them talk about how the world was created. Many of them deal with natural phenomena. Why does a volcano erupt? Why does a hurricane happen? Why do storms or rains, or, why do we not get rain? Why is rain withheld? Have we done something? Why do we have disease? Why do bad things happen? who decides who a hero is? What does it mean to be a hero? What does it mean to be divine? And what are gods really like? And so there are all these different stories and different ideas. And the truth is all of them have some sort of reflection upon the culture from which they come. And so recognizing where they come from and what they mean and what they're trying to, these stories are trying to say, is how we, in some ways, add meaning to the culture itself. Now, in Hinduism, which is the earliest of these, obviously it is polytheistic. There are many different gods, and I've marked a few of the big ones that, and they're described more in the chapter. But Hinduism definitely can be described by having quite a few artistic representations of gods and goddesses. It's very common for these illustrations to be in carvings, in idols, in some type of sanctuary, where the statue is in the center. They also are often decorating the outside of a church, of a temple that is, to either a particular god, or it could be a temple where you can worship several different gods, depending on which one you want to pray to at the beginning. They do find, there is kind of like, it's not yin and yang, but which we'll get to actually when we get to Taoism, but there is a balance to the universe, and the balance is between different gods. So Shiva is actually the destroyer god. And so that would seem to be the bad one, right? And yet he's the god of procreation and rebirth as well. And so in some ways, there's an acknowledgement that you can't create unless you destroy. And so it's almost the god of change, if that makes sense, where this is how things happen. Things have to die so that things can be reborn. And so that's what Shiva is. And the god is not a negative presence necessarily. Then, of course, we have Vishnu, who is definitely seen as beneficial, but even Shiva isn't necessarily unbeneficial. But Vishnu is the preserver. That's where we keep things from dying or keep things from being destroyed, and is also a guide. And so this focal god, this Vishnu, is often a god that guides heroes in several of the Hindu stories and Hindu books. And they all sound kind of like this. This is the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So they all have those kind of A's, and they're very lyrical names, but they're actually pretty good reads too. They're a little cryptic for us because we are not Hindu for the most part. If you are, you can, just raise your hand and go, I am, that's fine. I think it's awesome if you belong to any of these other groups, because so often, especially in the United States, we don't have a lot of experience or exchange of ideas or even understanding of these other faiths. So, but Vishnu is often a guide, certainly somebody that we asked, when we want something kept safe, that's a god that the people pray to, or when they are trying to find guidance, that's also typical. And then Brahma is the third main god. These are really the three biggies, and all three are considered to be a trinity and often seen as one and the same. So when you pray to one, you are essentially assumed to be praying to the other two as well. And the one that comes out to help is the one that is most needed, depending on what the issue is. But Brahma is the creator god. He's the one who made it so that the earth was created in the first place. And that, are there exact ties to the Christian Trinity? No. And they are still seen, they're one and the same, and yet they're still seen as separate deities as well. So that kind of does go with the Trinity, at least as most Christians see it, where it is a single God and yet also three separate at the same time. But we also have other, and if I were to list the number, all the gods, it would be impossible. First of all, Hinduism contains at least 500 or so gods. Many households have individual gods that other households don't even know about. And so Hinduism is, although it's highly polytheistic, it's far more individual depending on different families. And families will tend to have certain gods that are linked specifically to their family through the generations too. And so they may pass on stories about those gods that we don't in general understand or know of because we're just studying Hinduism overall. And so, but the truth is it's highly likely that there will be a multitude of temples in a specific area so that you can worship a multitude of different gods, and that there would be an altar or multiple altars inside of your house so that you could worship whatever god you needed at the time. The gods did, though, represent different things. And so, depending on what you needed, different gods would be prayed to. And so that's something to remember. It's not the same as monotheistic ones where that single monotheistic God is the one that everybody prays to. So the truth is that there is a lot, and there are goddesses as well. And so that, like Devi, the goddess, she's also called Durga, but she is definitely a female goddess, and yet she is seen as one of those powerful forces. So if you want energy behind you, you go and pray to Devi. But she's one of many. There are a large number of female goddesses as well. Does it tend to be more in the male centering? Yes. Does it tend to be patriarchal? Yes. But there are females as well. And often these gods are depicted in, not just in this kind of a pose, dancing or something like that. Many of them are depicted in the nude. Many, there is, in case you guys are wondering, there are depictions of them, of like, what is it? Trying to think of what it's called, but there are definitely long-standing illustrated books of uh, gods and goddesses in nude positions, or with each other, or, it's extremely common for them to be wearing little or nothing. That was not deemed to be sacrilegious or anything. And as you can see, this temple on the side, well, inside the temples are very well decorated. Lots of, and people who would bring prayers would bring these flowers and candles and other gifts to the altars as offerings when they were, making prayers. But you can see inside the, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see this. But inside the altar, oops, are, you can see the pillars are carved with figures. Some of them seated, like the lower parts of those pillars have seated figures, and then up above they have two figures actually dancing or moving together. And so that's very common. It's actually extremely ornate carvings, and you can see figures go all the way up through the dome of the temple. That's extremely common. They're I mean, extremely ornate. Whoever, whatever masters carved these really did an amazing job. But even on the outside of the temples are carved elements, and you'll see gods and goddesses carved all around. So on the outside, on this right picture, the same thing's going on. All of these little lines that you see have figures in between them, little sculpted. They're sculpted in relief, very deep relief, and yet the figures kind of pop out from the walls. And many of them are unclad, many of them are dancing or playing instruments or doing all sorts of other things. But that this is standard in a Hindu temple. Absolutely standard. This is what the norm is. This is not considered overly lavish, or and there was no thing about idolatry or anything. So it was extremely common for figures of gods to be sculpted into actual objects and to be placed in altars or in temples for worship. So, and from Hinduism, Buddhism came, and it took about 1,000 years after Hinduism, but Buddha, who was actually, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was a prince actually, and kind of lived in a palace. He never ventured outside. He was protected, as far, I think he was even married by the time he does finally go outside of his palace. But very wealthy, very, lavish lifestyle, but pretty much cloistered from the rest of India, from the people around him. And he was a Hindu, as were all of his family members and, everybody for the most part in his area. But when he stepped outside of the castle and outside of his palace and his protection, he realized how many people were not living the life that he lived. They were living lives where they were starving, where they, or at least very hungry, where they were, had almost nothing, where they had no shelter. You know, here he had this big palace where he was protected. They had nothing. They didn't have nice clothes. They didn't have nice anything. And he realized that the vast majority of the population was suffering and he wasn't. And he had, up until that point, ignored suffering, but it was definitely happening to most people. So he actually left his palace. He resigned his position essentially and left his family and went out into the woods and slowly, you know, first lived a life as a sort of a hermit and tried to teach Hinduism from the point of view of, you know, how do we get by with less, and then realize essentially that this was a different kind of thing. Now, one thing I want you to, and we're going to come back to Buddhism for a second, but one thing that's very typical of Hinduism, and it's an idea that Buddhism shares, both of them are in the same boat, is they don't have a, there's not this idea of an afterlife where, like, you know, the Egyptians had all of this, you know, this is what the afterlife is going to be like, and you know, bury yourself with a bunch of stuff, and then you get to take it with you into heaven. For both Hinduism and Buddhism, the standard way of point of thought is that they believed in reincarnation. And so when you die, rather than going off to a heaven, you kind of go back through the system and you were born again as something else or someone else. And what you essentially, your path and the next life is determined by how much you've learned. Are you doing the right things? Are you, you know, being the kind of person that you should be, and how do you get to the next level? Essentially, if you're a good person and you live a good life and you do good things, then the next life is, you're going to move up and you're going to get closer and closer to enlightenment, to essentially, for Hinduism, it's nirvana. So that point where you are at one with the universe and you don't have to complete reincarnation anymore. You're all done because your soul has gone about as far as it can go. It's reached that point of illumination and lack of egotism and everything else, so that it doesn't have to return and it has nothing else to learn. And so for Buddhists, the same thing applies. Eventually, you know, if you live the right life, then you will not have to keep going through reincarnation. But for Buddhism, there's a slight shift. It's essentially Buddhism, and Buddha actually means, and it's not a name. His name was, of course, Siddhartha Gautama, but he was named the Buddha. And there are other people within that faith who would become a Buddha because they reach that point of enlightenment when they don't have to come back and regenerate. And it usually means that you get to that point where you understand the noble truths and you understand where you fit within the universe, and you understand that that's not a big role and that you are not the center of the world. So narcissism is like the opposite of Buddhist enlightenment, you know, where you think only of yourself, and, you know, selfishness and those kinds of things, and insensitivity to others, you know, lack of compassion. Those are all anti-Buddhist enlightenment. So essentially what he said is, you know, Buddha decided, well, you know, life is suffering. And the way that you're suffering less, how do you suffer less? You suffer less because you want less. The more you want, the more you desire, the more stuff you need, the more unhappy you're going to be. And happiness is not reached because you get stuff, because you get the big mansion and you have the nice car and you get the, you know, the super hot husband or wife. It's that you are happy with less food, less shelter, less comfort, less everything, that it becomes far, far less about you and your needs and much more about how you do other things. So essentially he's suggested meditation. And then the Eightfold Path is the other key, you know, but you meditate pretty much on what the universe is and where you fit in it. And the truth is all of these ideas, you know, they call it the right path, but it's not the right path. It's not even, you know, like perfect. It's almost like it's closer to perfected, or proper. That's proper is probably the best equivalent in English, but it means that you're seeing things clearly, that you understand the world as it really is. You're seeing truth, not bias, not political affiliation does not matter. You know, so people who get really angry on Facebook, they are not following the Eightfold Path, because they're seeing the world from a very skewed point of view, and a very emotional point of view, and they are specifically, often they're getting toxic. So you think about like proper emotion. You shouldn't get over angry when someone doesn't agree with you. People who get really, vicious on social media or on the news or in politics, those people are taking it, they shouldn't be that emotional about it. They shouldn't be that angry. And they certainly shouldn't resort to violence. Proper speech means you use words the way you should. Don't use them against people. Don't use them unkindly. Don't say mean things just to win. And even proper action, do what's right for people, not just what serves yourself. If you're selfish and you're keeping, you're hoarding food when other people are starving, well, that's not proper action. And if you're stealing from people, obviously that's even worse. That's definitely not proper action, because you're exploiting the weaknesses in other people and taking what you want, even if it's not what you need. But everything is about being kind, about living peacefully with other people. And Buddhism is definitely one of those. It's not really a faith system, in that there's not really a God for most sects of Buddhism. Most sects of Buddhism don't have a deity. There are a few, although it's funny, because Buddha said before he died, Siddhartha Gautama made it very clear that that he was not a god. No one should worship him, and that they shouldn't make statues of him. And yet Buddhism is best known by all of the statues of Buddha that are all over the place. And there are a few sects of Buddhism where they do actually worship him as a god. The vast majority do not, however. They see him as much more of a guide. His teachings he's like a teacher as opposed to any sort of deity. Although they do see him as enlightened enough so that he's not coming back to earth in other forms. He's done with the reincarnation part. But each one of these is about doing what's best, without emotion, without bias, without selfishness, but trying to do what's best to serve the universe and to serve the people around you. But it's the whole lack of selfishness and pride that's essential to following the Eightfold Path. It's all about humbling yourself and not seeing yourself as more important than other people, or seeing your viewpoint as the only viewpoint. Being able to learn helps you have a less biased viewpoint. Buddhist architecture, the temples actually look a lot, you can see just from here, they look a lot like, let me show you the Hindu one. They have those taller spires and everything. Inside though, and there's the statue of Buddha, although there are so many. And depending on where you are, because Buddhism spread all the way over to Japan, literally, but depending on where you live, Buddha is going to look very different. So the Japanese Buddha is quite squishy, and the Indian Buddha tends to be a little less squishy. But I don't know why they made him squishy, and I just don't understand. But the temples outside are quite ornate, as you can see. Inside, the sanctuaries are not decorated the way, like remember the Hindu sanctuary are all flowers and candles and all that. But Buddhist ones are actually very plain inside. It's much more about meditating, and it's, all those other things would be a distraction. Some are decorated, but the vast majority are quite plain inside, and often they're pretty dark. But all you do is you take a cloth out, you sit on the cloth and meditate. So they don't really have the same types of altars too, because they don't have 500 gods that people are trying to worship or pray to. Even though it stems from Hinduism, that's not what it's about. And there are quite a few people who are both Hindu and Buddhist. There are also people, I have met several who are Taoist and Buddhist, who are Christian and Buddhist. So they find their philosophical elements to Buddhism that fit with a lot of teaching. And certainly, because they are very much pacifistic, they don't believe in war. And Buddhism is one of the most, probably, it may be the most populous religion that has never caused any conflicts. So Buddhists don't run out and attack other faiths and try to, kill them or off, or, make them all be Buddhists, or that just never happened. For Buddhism, it's integrated into Buddhism is pacifism. That war is never okay, killing is never okay, and it's never justified. So it's a very different faith than quite a few others that we know of. And historically, literally over 2,500 years, Buddhism is not, it's not the, Buddhist groups don't get together and then form armies and go and attack. No, does not happen. But they do often meld well with other faiths, as we'll see. So just like the ones I named. As far as, we already talked about Buddha and how Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, and how he didn't want to be a figure. Though there are definitely other people who have been over the years, over the centuries, deemed to have reached enlightenment, and they become a Buddha as well. And you too, Buddhism teaches, you too can become a Buddha. You just have to reach that point of enlightenment. And it may take you lifetimes, it may take you 100 lifetimes, but eventually, if you keep on working on it, you'll get there. I know it's a very different idea than a lot of people are probably used to. Now we get to Judaism, and Judaism is again really old. It's actually older than Buddhism. I just switched them because the other two are kind of connected. But Judaism is the first known monotheistic faith that we have, and it becomes the kind of the springboard from which both Christianity and Islam will come. They were for the longest time nomadic tribes. Most of them, they have all these early histories, and then we get to the point where essentially we get to Israel, or Abraham, and he has, there's, well, no, not Israel. We get to Abraham, or he was Abram, and then he's very old before he has a child, and then he has a kid, and then that kid has two kids, and then one of those two kids end up, kind of springing the rest of it. So Jacob and Esau were twins. Jacob tricked his father essentially into giving him his blessing and making him the inheritor of stuff. And so Jacob fled, then he returned, and he becomes Israel. And he has 12 kids, 12 boys. He has other girls too, but all of the descendants of Israel come, again, they're descendants of Jacob, but he's renamed Israel, and so they're all descendants of Israel, and they're Israelites. And it's not just because they live in Israel, that actually came far later. But Islam will actually trace itself from two of the sons of Israel. And so they tie their links to Judaism as well. And even in the Quran mentions Judaism and Christians, because Islam is the last of the three monotheistic faiths. But all three of them are tied together. Now, they do have stories. I mean, obviously, there are a bunch of stories. And if you are Christian and you've read any of the Old Testament, those are all Judaic texts. They were all originally in Hebrew. And they were probably passed down for hundreds of years before ever being written on scrolls. But, and let me show you the scroll for a second, because I want you to kind of see, it's not the way we typically have books. So this is a picture that shows the scrolls, and they would be written in columns. And what would happen is, instead of opening a book, you'd unroll the scroll. And so you'd read the next column, and you'd roll up the scroll as you unrolled the other side of the scroll until you got through the entire scroll. So it's just a different way of reading, but you kind of have to read in order, because it would take a lot, if you were skipping from one book to a different book and going way forward or way back, you'd have to be doing a lot of unscrolling and scrolling. So typically they read it in order. They wrote it in order, column by column by column, and then they read it in order. These were often written in papyrus, and the papyrus can degenerate pretty fast. It tends not to last, and so they would have to be rewritten and recopied over the years. So we don't have any papyrus scrolls that are from 2500 or 3000 BCE. We just don't. We don't have any of that. But there are quite a few Orthodox Jewish churches that still have scrolls like this and still use them actively in worship. So the tradition is still kept alive this way. It's just not probably what we were used to. They did have the Ark of the Covenant, and in the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue. So, thou shalt not kill, and shalt not lie, and all that stuff. Will bear false witness, and that kind of stuff. Well, in the first Judaic temple, when they actually finally settled in Canaan, the first temple, and all of their temples are kind of this in a similar pattern. They have this open area where people can come in and worship, but then behind a curtain or a screen or something is what they call, that's where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. It's the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest at that time can go back to the Holy of Holies and actually see the Ark of the Covenant. It's so absolutely so sacred that it's not even kept within sight of humans. So all the rest of the congregation, they just come in. Then now it's funny because they built this originally as a tent. It was a semi-permanent tent, but it was still a tent. Then they built an actual temple. But the first temple was the Babylonian army came in and destroyed it. And in fact, the Babylonian army tried to come in and take the Holy of Holies, tried to take the Ark of the Covenant. But when they went in and ransacked the temple, it was gone. And honestly, we've supposedly, if somebody knows where it is, they're keeping a really good secret because we've never found it since. Now, if you are a big fan of Indiana Jones, the very first movie, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, is about the Ark of the Covenant being sought by the Nazis. And its ending is a little suspect because, that they have the Nazis decide to open the Ark of the Covenant and all these weird, creepy things come out, this winds and stuff, and they rip everybody's faces off. So if you haven't seen that movie, it's very entertaining. I like but it's not likely to be that accurate, at least not that we know of. And according to them, of course, it's in the Ark is now in a box hidden somewhere in some storage facility in the United States. But that's fiction. That's not even myth. Okay, y'all. But they did build the temple again. And eventually the second temple would be destroyed by Rome after, it's essentially in 70 CE. So after Christianity began. But Christians and Jews, once Christianity begins, Jews and Christians don't necessarily get along. And we'll talk about why. With Jewish worship, though, and some of you might find some of these things, wow, we do that too, but Judaism did have actual musical instruments in worship, but they did not sing with musical instruments. So any singing was done through a song leader of some kind who would lead the chanting or singing. Usually it would be psalms. In fact, the word psalm actually means song. And they mean the same thing. But they would sing in the congregation, but they would sing a cappella. They would sing without instrumental accompaniment. And they would also have instrumental music, but they would not have it at the same time, if that makes any sense. And they did decorate the place with symbols. The menorah was definitely a symbol. The Star of David was definitely a symbol they used. People, though, were not to be depicted. And God especially was never, ever, 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 forever to be depicted in any sort of physical form. That was idolatry. Whether it was two-dimensional or three-dimensional, it was idolatry. They wanted definitely to make a statement against the polytheistic societies all around them. So not only did they only have one God, they saw that God is the only God. So all of the polytheistic systems were invalid. but they also never could depict that God as in any sort of human form or in any sort of form. You're not supposed to do that. That's wrong. And so there's definitely still, for most Jews and most Jewish temples, there's no decoration inside, or if there is, it's just symbolic. It's not, they don't decorate it with, different Judaic heroes like Noah or something like that. That's not allowed. And Christianity will actually follow those patterns for several hundred years. Islam still today has that same forbidding. They do not allow idolatry of any kind. So there is no decoration inside of actual pictures. The only decoration you'll see inside of mosques, that Islamic mosques, are actual textual, like calligraphy from the Quran. So that they'll allow the word of their holy text to be up on the wall, but not illustrations of people. They're going to continue that taboo. Christianity actually was founded in Judea among the Jewish community. So Jesus was born Jewish. He practiced Judaism during his life. And yet we know that his crucifixion came as a result of really, some of it was because he was going against some of the Judaic teachings and kind of bucking that authority a bit, the authority of the Pharisees, for instance, within the Jewish hierarchy, but also because Judaism the Judaic communities were often rebelling against Roman rule. And so there was already a lot of unrest and we're not sure exactly how all of it worked together, but certainly there was a mixture of fear of what the Romans would do, if Jesus did too much, and also fear of that Jesus was corrupting the Jewish faith. And so there was all this kind of mixture. Whichever happened, I mean, either way, Jesus was crucified. So he only lived somewhere between 30 and 33 years, and then was executed by Romans, actually. And he was executed along with a couple of other people who were criminals for different things. But that story of him, of the crucifixion, of his life, going through, his birth, his life, and then his crucifixion and then resurrection, became the source of information for 4 different gospels, actually more than 4, but 4 of them ended up being used as texts within the New Testament. The first 4 books of the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the 4 gospels. There are other gospels as well, but when Jesus died, and then after he died, after he was crucified, a bunch of different gospels were written by a number of different sources, and they were passed along. There wasn't really a unified New Testament. Each little group of Christians, wherever they happen to be, would have 1 or 2, or they'd exchange gospels with other little groups of Christians, and those gospels all kind of got spread around. Most of them were written in Greek or Aramaic, because even though they were in the Roman Empire, the vast majority of the population was more likely to speak Greek than Latin. And so they were meant to be, what's most readable? What was the most accessible language? And that was Greek. Although a few were written in Aramaic instead, depending on who wrote them. But then all of these different groups, all of these different texts were kind of floating around, and it actually created a lot of different ideas about what Christianity was, about who Jesus was, about who Mary was, about some of the events and what was factual and what really happened. And so there was some division over the next couple of hundred years after it started. There was a lot of division about what did Christians believe? Even questions like about circumcision, which were very traditionally part of Judaism. People who were Judaic and then switched over to Christianity were often circumcised or continued the practice. People who were not Jews, who were Gentiles, that's the non-Jew, and who became Christian often were not circumcised. And so there was a big question of, should Christians become circumcised the way Jews are? And those are questions that are actually dealt with in the New Testament even. So there was a lot of discussion and argument about what it was that Christians did or did not believe. And we're going to come back to them after we talk about, I just wanted to show the links between Judaism and Christianity first. Now we go to Zoroastrianism, which you've probably never heard of, although it still exists today. In fact, if you've seen the movie, it's totally accurate about this particular aspect anyway, of Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. His family was Zoroastrian, and Zoroastrianism still exists today. It is still monotheistic. And it's actually, we think that some Christian precepts actually stemmed from Zoroastrianism, because Judaism does not contain some of these same ideas. The whole idea of light being good and dark being evil, or night being, the time of evil, and the daytime being the time of good, that's a Zoroastrian idea. So that kind of dichotomy is Zoroastrian, not Judaic. They also had baptism, they had communion, they had a lot of the, typical rites that are not part of Judaism, but were definitely part of several different secret cults, including Mithraism that we covered in chapter 3. And so there were quite a few ideas in Zoroastrianism that end up being adopted by Christianity as well. And certainly the idea is that people all have free will, but and this is shared actually with Judaism. God wants you to do good things because it will end up making you happy. And so if you don't do what God says, then you're going to cause yourself a lot of trouble. And that's where you fall into problems. It's not, God doesn't want things just because he likes rules. He actually wants you to be a better person because it'll make you happier. And that's very much a Judaic idea, and it's very much a Christian idea as well. So, and that includes, there's some very specific things, tell the truth, give to people who are less fortunate than you are, be compassionate, even with difficult people, and be moderate in your cravings. Don't indulge yourself in too much food, wine, or anything else. And so, a lot of those you could probably find very similar ideas in almost any faith, but they're certainly part of Zoroastrianism. Now, they did have names for instance, the main god was Ahura Mazda, which is funny that we have a car company named, Mazda, but his name was Ahura Mazda, and then the bad guy was Angra Mainyu. And Ahura Mazda was a representative of heaven, of light, of all that was good, and Angra Mainyu was hell. And that's one thing too with Christianity. Hell and heaven are pretty much tenets. They're parts of the faith, that there's a heaven and a hell. For most Muslims as well, heaven and hell are definitely a reward you get once you die. Judaism does not have heaven and hell. They believe that hell happens when you're away from God, and that can happen in your own life. That when you sin, you pull yourself away from God, and it's not about what reward you're going to get in the afterlife. It's about doing the right things now and the life you live now. For Zoroastrians, however, heaven and hell are absolute truths. And so that's one reason why we say Christianity and Islam, although Islam probably got it from Christianity, Christianity definitely drew some ideas from Zoroastrianism, although they stemmed from Judaism, if that makes sense. Now let's talk about a totally different idea. This is often seen to be much more of a philosophy, and that's Taoism. You can call it Taoism, but it's not really true. It's often even spelled with a D instead. And Tao, the word Tao, just means the way. And so Taoism is not necessarily about worshiping certain people or doing anything specific like that, or, a path to heaven. Taoism isn't really talking about that. It's much more about how do you live your life. And the truth for the Tao, there are two things. One, find balance. So the yin and yang symbol is so much a part of Taoism, because you can't have, for Zoroastrians, there's good, that's light, and there's bad, that's darkness. For Taoism, it's not good versus bad. You have to have both sides of everything to balance out yourself. So there's work and effort and, that kind of stuff. And there's play and there's pleasure and there's happiness. You have to have both sides of yourself or you're not complete. If you have too much pleasure, you lose your job because you don't ever go. You run out of money and starve because you're out seeking pleasure instead of working. But you throw yourself out of balance. Too much work, you get sick. You become desperate and tired all the time. You're depressed. All this stuff. And so essentially, what they say is everything needs to be in balance. And the life, because of that, is in a constant state of change. You should always be reassessing the balance in your life and finding that nice balanced way so that you can have both sides of your life and all the parts kind of fit together. But you should expect change. Change is the constant. Life will change, people die, people leave, people come, people go, things happen, and much of it is out of your control. But your job is to figure out your path through this. And it's not a path that goes against the current, it goes with the current or the way or the path. Your life gets easy when you go in the way that the universe wants you to go. Your life gets hard when you buck up against it. So they're very much into have the humility to listen to the universe and not insist on your own way, because your own way is often not the way that you really should be going. So it's not about good versus evil. It's about going with the flow of your life, with the way, with that path that is before you, and not hurting yourself trying to buck up against it. So the main thing is, they're obviously with that balance and harmony are the two sides. You plant seeds when they can grow. Don't plant them in the dead of winter, because they'll freeze and die. Plant them when they're, it's the best time for them to generate and to germinate and grow and turn into nice plants. Find balance in the environment. Don't create too much pollution, which we're not doing so well, but also don't let things run amok. You have to find a balance. If there are too many deer, they die. They starve to death. There's not enough to feed them. So balance that out and make sure there's enough deer, but there's not too many, so that they live a happy life. But everything is about that balance. And everything is about, everything in moderation and everything in a constant change and flux. And so you're always finding that nice balance. Think of it almost like a watery sort of philosophy, where you're following a river, and the river path is always changing, and it's always picking up sediment off the bottom of the river, and so it's always churning up stuff, and then things are also drifting to the side, and they're also, creatures are climbing out. Sometimes you get out, but you're following that flow. And the more you follow it, the easier it is. You don't have to swim that hard. If you turn around and try to go upriver, you're going to be swimming really hard and get nowhere. And that's the essence of Taoism. So you go with the flow, and then your life gets easier because you're not fighting against the natural universal flow of things. So it's really, it's all through, there's some really interesting books, and most of them are almost poetic in their way of expressing these truths, but they're quite readable if you're interested. And many people too you can be Taoist and be many other religions. That's why I say it's more of a philosophy. Confucianism is also pretty philosophical. It doesn't have a god system. It's very much part of the ancient China, although it has spread, throughout Asia, and there's some pockets of it in the Middle East. Certainly quite a bit spread to Japan. But Confucius was a philosopher of the 5th century BCE. So, we're talking 500s something to 400 something. And he mostly described, there's a lot, he wrote a ton, and actually, even today, Chinese people study Confucian teachings, but most of his stuff was about, it was about order, about social structure, about behavior. How do you behave in certain situations? About choosing the honesty over lying or deception, choosing deference to older people, being respectful as opposed to being mean. But it's much more moralistic than anything else. And it's really talking about social conventions too. How do you treat people with courtesy? And honesty? How do you give people their fair share? How do you prevent selfishness or teach your children to not be selfish? And so there's a lot of that kind of idea that you can actually teach people to behave properly. And it's in some ways opposed to, Taoism is much more free flowing, but Confucianism was still an idea that there is a social order. And when you maintain the social order, there's far less unrest. There's far less violence. There's far less dissension and discomfort. But it's definitely, more than anything, it emphasizes being a kind person and being generous to others and using your conscience as your guide. So there's the Geppetto. Don't do what you know is hurtful to other people. Choose the choice that benefits the most people. And even if it doesn't benefit you, don't be selfish. Have compassion for others, especially those who are elderly. There was definitely, and especially parents and grandparents, they defer to their judgment because they're older and wiser than you are. And but most people aren't Confucian today. They study Confucius, but they don't really practice this. This is one of the few faiths that really doesn't govern people's lives the way that many of these other faiths do. Okay, now we get to Christianity. And I know this is going to take a while, but a lot of you may already know some, but this was, it stemmed, I already talked a little bit about Jesus, and yet his teachings essentially started a shift in movement that really came from Judaism originally. And yet after he was executed, after he was crucified, his purported resurrection, they went to the grave to go and the rock was moved and he'd been taken out. So when you think about the burial mounds that were common, that we talked about in chapter 1, for instance, where they'd take the body down into the tunnel and then they'd cover it all over. Well, whatever had been put in place to close the tomb had been opened, and his body was gone. Jewish faith, the reason I say it comes from Judaism is, first of all, yes, he was a Jew. He was living in a Jewish community, but many of the teachings of the Messiah, the Christ, Christo is the Greek version. But so Jesus Christ, that just means Jesus the Messiah. And that Messiah was foretold in Judaic texts, not anywhere else. Many other people had come forward as messiahs before. Some of them had met very untimely ends, like Jesus, but this is the only one where his teachings were written down, even if it was several decades later. But other people wrote down about what he said. Now, it's funny because in all of these faiths, we talk about Zoroaster, we talk about Buddha, we talk about Jesus, and then we'll talk about Muhammad for Islam. And yet all of these leaders did not write anything down. Jesus wrote nothing. His followers wrote things. And with Muhammad, same thing. Muhammad wrote nothing down, but his followers wrote down. They transcribed the Quran. With Siddhartha Gautama, he wrote nothing down. He taught a bunch of other people stuff, and then they wrote things down. But he wrote nothing himself. And that's actually pretty standard. So I guess that's typical of faiths. Usually because the person who's founded it, who's done most of the teaching, is gone. So after Buddha died, then all those students wrote down a bunch of stuff about this is what it means to be Buddhist, because this is what he taught us. And that's kind of what happened too. All of the texts that became part of the New Testament were written after he died. And many of them, some as many as 50, 70, 80 years after he died. A lot of them were written, over half of the texts in Christianity were written by Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul. He was actually a Pharisee. He persecuted Christians as heretics from Judaism, and he was blinded on the road to Damascus. And then when his sight came back, he became a Christian. He converted to Christianity, and he wrote about half of the New Testament documents. So, and most of them are letters to different pockets of Christians all around the Mediterranean. So if he wrote to Ephesus, Ephesians became the book of those letters. If he wrote to Galatia, then Galatians became, each one is different places that he wrote to. But a lot of people consider him to be like the co-founder of Christianity, because he did so much to shape what Christianity was and what its beliefs were and what its practices should be. So, but it's funny because early Christians kind of followed a lot of the ideas of Judaism. Paul, for instance, did suggest that everyone should get, he didn't say that they had to, but he said everyone should get, all the men should get circumcised because of the Judaic tradition. And yet, the vast majority of early Christians did. But what's funny is that at this time, of course, there were not, all they had were letters from Paul and different, you can see when the individual gospels were most likely written. And so most of them, I mean, the earliest one that was probably written was Mark's. The earliest it could have been written was 68 CE. And so that was 30 something years after Jesus had been crucified. And many of them were written more like 50 years after. So, but following the Judaic tradition as well, Christians did not create idols of Jesus, of Mary, of any of the figures, or even of any of the apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They didn't, that was forbidden because that's idolatry. So they were following those same rules that the Jewish populations had followed. And that would stay the same even within churches. Churches would be very plain. And for a while there were no churches because being Christian meant you really needed to be secret. A lot of their symbology was meant to be cryptic so that it was not easily recognizable. In fact, if you take the fish, it's actually ichthus in Greek. And that just means Jesus. So there's Jesus, the X is Christ, God, that's the center one, Son, and Savior. But that fish, that's actually fish, was actually a symbol that they used to identify each other. So someone who came to a new community was a Christian, but couldn't tell everybody he was a Christian because he'd end up being fed to the lions in the Colosseum, would just take his toe while he was standing there. He'd take his toe and make a little arched line with his toe in the sand. Then the other person, if he wasn't Christian, would just go, wow, that's okay. And he wouldn't even notice. But if he were a Christian, then he would make a matching symbol to create the fish in the soil. And so each of those people, if they would recognize the other person was Christian, and that person, the new person would be set up, they'd actually get to go and find another little group of hidden Christians. And then and anybody around them wouldn't necessarily know what they were even doing. They just see them scratching their toes in the sand and go, wow, that's weird. But it was a way for them to find their communities without exposing themselves. And so, but they also had other symbols. You can see the Latin cross down at kind of in the middle of the page at the bottom. That's very common, a very common cross that people wear, in necklace. I have several crosses. The Greek cross is less well known because the Greek cross was adopted by the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. And we'll talk about them in a second. But there are several other crosses. You can see the Maltese cross. And then the papal cross is the one at the bottom with 3 things across. But that's used by the Pope. So that's not us. And then you can see those other symbols. The truth is none of the people, like none of the prophets, nobody was supposed to be depicted as a person. Like the fact that we have paintings today of Jesus would have horrified very early Christians because that was not okay. That's creating an idol to be worshipped, even in 2-dimensional form. Now they're going to change those rules once we get to the Council of Nicaea. Well, a little bit after that. The Council of Nicaea was created when Constantine, who was the emperor of Rome and of the Roman Empire, which persecuted Christians, he decided he was going to become a Christian. Literally. First, he published the Edict of Milan that said, don't persecute Christians anymore. You have to feed somebody else, the lions. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. It did happen. Jews definitely got fed to the lions too, but then Christians kind of took over when they became less popular. But Constantine said, no, this is not allowed anymore. And in truth, the Roman Empire tended not to discriminate against any faiths, except for Judaism and Christianity. The rest of them, they just let go. But again, most of the faiths at that time were polytheistic. These were the only two that were not, that were populated anyway. And then finally, Constantine said, I'm going to be a Christian. And he called the Council of Nicaea. And that council was to decide what is it that Christianity was. What were Christians supposed to believe? What was church supposed to be like? What was the Bible going to be made of? And this council very quickly went to the side of Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox just means right thought. It means we're the ones who are right. When they named themselves Orthodox, that just said, they just said we're the ones with the correct belief and all the rest of the people are wrong. Gnostics that just means knowing. That's where we get the word agnostic, not knowing. But Gnostics just, they didn't believe some of the things that the Orthodox Christians believed. They did not, some of them really doubted, they weren't even sure exactly what Jesus was. If he was a deity, was he God, or was he God's son, or what was he? And they did not follow the Trinity. And they also questioned whether Mary was actually a virgin or not when she gave birth to, or whether he was just naturally born. And for Orthodox Christianity, she was absolutely a virgin, and God had absolutely placed Jesus inside her. So she had not known any man. And so, and Arians, another sect of Christianity at that time, didn't believe that Jesus was necessarily divine. They saw him as a prophet, and they didn't really believe in the Trinity either. And so both of those two very early on were deemed to be heretical. So the Council of Nicaea essentially decided, if you're going to be Christian, you have to believe in the virgin birth. You have to believe that he died for your sins on the cross, that's what the crucifixion meant. You had to believe that Jesus was divine, and you had to believe in the Trinity. Those are required, or you are not Christian. And what they did after that, unfortunately, they developed the Nicene Creed. I don't know if any of you have ever given it. It's very short, but I actually know it by heart just because so many churches I've been to say it. But it says, I believe in that he was born of a virgin. I believe that he, was crucified and dead and buried. I believe that he was resurrected. I believe, it says all these I believes because they wanted to, this is the stipulation. This is what you have to believe if you are Christian. They also, after that, when they decided that, well, let's put a Bible together. They selected, not all of, but some of the Judaic texts that had been used by Hebrews for centuries. And then they selected some, but not all, of the new texts that had been floating around. The Gnostic Gospels were out of hand rejected. In fact, Orthodox followers tried to destroy any copies there were of these texts. They didn't succeed. Today, you can actually buy, there are translations of them online, or you can buy them at Amazon. You can get Gnostic Gospels. But they wanted Gnostics and Arians to be not only deemed heretics, but to be destroyed. So from the beginning of this, formal Christianity, there was an attempt to weed out and destroy people who didn't believe the same way. And it's pretty toxic. We're going to show later on, the majority of us today in the United States are not even Catholic. We are Protestant. And yet Protestantism came at after a lot of violence, let me put it that way. So it came because of this insistence that, well, I'm right and therefore you're going to die. And that kind of happened early on with the Council of Nicaea. So almost immediately, though, it shifted into two Orthodox branches. One was the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and they took all of the Judaic texts from the Old Testament and all of the New Testament and translated it all into Latin. And this was the main difference between them and the Eastern or Greek Orthodox Church. In the Eastern side, and they form the Western half of the Roman Empire. In the Eastern half of the Roman Empire is the Eastern or Greek Orthodox Church. They took the same texts pretty much, made the Bible, but they translated it all into, the New Testament was already in Greek, so they just kept it that way. And then the Old Testament, they translated into Greek, and they kept the Greek Bible, essentially. So that's the big difference between these two branches, is what Bible they used. But from the very beginning, the Holy Roman Catholic Church insisted that no part of the Bible could be translated from Latin into any other language. And they would insist on this for the next, over 1,000 years. And they would actually execute people who tried to translate the Bible. They would also destroy their copies. And then, of course, we eventually get to Martin Luther, who translated the Bible into German, was excommunicated, and then his execution order was actually published, but he was never found by the Catholic Church to be executed. But he also published his and printed it, and that was the end of no more translation. So but they split, and the Roman side, the Western half of the Roman Empire in Rome would fall in 476. The Eastern half would end up lasting until like 1483 or something like that. So now Christian architecture, very often, because of course it started in Rome, it would very much be patterned after the basilica that was typical of pre-Christian religious buildings. They don't look like the Pantheon, which was actually a very roundish building, but they are elongated, and then they had an arch in the center. So this overall area in the middle of the, if you look at the floor plan, would be arched. Most of the insides, though, at the beginning were very plain. And so you can see here the eastern half of the Roman Empire is the red, and its center is its capital city is Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. And then the western half of the center is Rome. And then Rome would fall, and the Roman Empire would fall, but the Holy Roman Catholic Church would it still exists, as does the Greek Orthodox Church. Although Greek Orthodox faith actually would spread all the way up into Russia, and it's actually more prevalent in the East still today, in the Middle East and in Turkey and things like that, and in Egypt. So, and it would last for a long time, but it wasn't nearly as, over the top aggressive. Now, as far as Eastern architecture, this was originally a Greek Orthodox church, the Hagia Sophia. It's one of the most famous and oldest and largest churches in the world. It is still in use today, and you can see the scaffolding when they're trying to rebuild parts of it. Instead of being written, so this one is kind of elongated. It's actually in the form of a Latin cross. It's upside down with the floor plan, but it has a very long middle, and then it has those sidebars, and that creates a Latin cross. For the Greeks, though, the cross was the opposite way. Remember, it's a square cross. And so it has a central dome, the Hagia Sophia does, and then in domes you can see the arches on the side, and then it offshoots into 4 different rooms in the 4 cardinal directions. And so it forms a cross. And then in the corners between those general directions are 4 towers. And you can see that in the upper, see those 4 towers? So you have the center, and then it shoots off into 4 different directions in the form of a Greek cross. And then it has the towers on the outside of each of the main building. But today it is a mosque. And it's funny because if you were to actually study architecture from this time period, a lot of Catholic churches became mosques, and a lot of mosques, once we get to Islam, have become Catholic churches or Eastern Orthodox churches. So it's funny because even if land changed hands or different religious groups took over, they all adopted the sacred spaces as sacred spaces. Now, what this was originally Greek Orthodox, and so it had a lot more decoration inside. Greek Orthodox and Holy Roman Catholic churches very quickly started to decorate their interior with people and with statues and things like that. But Islam says that none of that's okay. And so all of those were taken out, and all that remains inside is gold leafing and then some Arabic script from the Quran. But it's still used as a sacred space even today. And it is gigantic. It is far bigger than you can even tell from this kind of a picture. It is, and it's absolutely beautiful inside. And the gold leafing, you know, it wears away, so they have to put it back up. So it's very expensive to maintain, but it's quite beautiful. Now, Islam, it was by far the newest of all these religions that we've covered, and it was founded in the 7th century. 622 is the beginning of the Islamic religious calendar. So the common era that we talk about, that's the beginning of the Christian calendar. Well, Islam has a different year. They're celebrating a different year right now because their calendar began in 622 CE, if that makes sense, with the beginning of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad was orphaned at 6. He actually was raised by his uncle, and he was on the caravans of traders that would travel all through the Middle East. And he was really upset by some of the typical behaviors of the Arabic community. And so he didn't like the fact that people didn't care for the weak, especially for women and widows and children. And it was a very patriarchal society, but he was very upset that those people in power treated those who were not in power so badly. And so he thought that a lot of the Arabs could really learn from Christianity and Judaism. And he came across a lot of Jews and Christians because of his trade. And so he read a lot of their texts and learned a lot from them. And then he started receiving these dreams. And in his dreams, the angel Gabriel came to him and told him he needed to write this down, and he needed to be a prophet of God. Now, that is the Christian God. So in Judaism, we use the name Yahweh, although Jews rarely use that word, but it's like the Yiddish name or whatever of the God, the main God of Judaism. The English version is Jehovah. And so that's why we have things like Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of people in today's world will even say, okay, there's Jehovah, and then there's Jesus, and you know, and then there's the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. But in Islam, because of Arabic, that version, that word Yahweh, is Allah in Arabic. So he is deemed by Islam, by Muslims, to be the exact same God that was the creator of the universe, according to Jews, and was the father of Jesus, according to Christians. And so what they don't accept, though, and this is where there are some differences automatically from Christianity, is for Islam, for Muslims, Jesus is not the son of God. He is a prophet, but he's not the son. And neither is Muhammad. Muhammad is not the son of God. He is only a prophet. He is not a deity, nor is he related to a deity. But there is actually a section in the Quran where he says that God could not have a son, that's not okay to believe that any person could have that designation of deity. Even if he was a great prophet, he's only a prophet. Although there are quite a few, if you read any of the Quran, which they don't want you to translate. It's typical in Islam for people who convert to learn Arabic so that they can read the Quran untranslated. I've only read parts translated, so I can't, speak to that. But there are chapters on several Judaic heroes, people like Noah and Moses and Joseph, for instance, Joseph of the brothers underneath Israel, under Jacob. And there are also chapters on Mary and Jesus and some of the New Testament events. So the truth is there's a lot of transference of different ideas. They're just stated somewhat differently in the Quran than they were in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, in the Judaic texts and the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, once he began preaching, he did not write anything down, only his students did, but they wrote down his visions, what he described as his visions, and they wrote it all in Arabic. And even today, there are some beautiful texts that have been created, illuminated manuscripts of handwritten Arabic texts. And he began the Islamic calendar in 622. And he definitely suggested that there were a lot of things that the Arabic community needed to learn from Judaism and Christianity. They needed to be more compassionate. They needed to be less about war, and they needed to be more caring for those in need. So giving alms is a tenet. It's a requirement of Islam that you give to the needy and the poor. There are several other requirements. Obviously they're monotheistic in the same way that Christianity and Judaism are. And Jesus is a prophet. He is not, there's no shame in Jesus. He's absolutely deemed to be a prophet, but Muhammad is the final prophet of the true faith. And they absolutely believe no graven images, no idolatry, no sculptures of people or God. None of that's okay. The only of these three faiths, these monotheistic faiths, the only one that changed was Christianity. Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox faiths both began to do a tremendous number of sculptures and two-dimensional paintings of God, of prophets, of Jesus, and of Mary. So that would be the big shift that would happen in art. And I may have a question about that, which one changed their mind about art? And it was not, both Islam and Judaism today maintain that iconoclasm, the rejection of idolatry. They also have music almost exactly the same way. And there's some Christian faiths that do this too, where they don't have accompaniment. People sing a cappella. With Muslims, there was no instrumental music that accompanied voices. So they usually had a song leader. In fact, in certain places where Muslims are the majority, they will even be over loudspeakers and have a song leader sing and the chants and lead the prayers. So that's a very common even today. And I guess the biggest thing, they do pray 5 times a day, Muslims do. And they do, I told you that one of their tenets was you had to give alms to the poor. And then they fast during Ramadan. And they needed, if they could, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca in their lifetime. Now, if they couldn't make it, it's not like they were going to go to hell. Though they do believe in heaven and hell, just like Christians do. And then they have this term jihad, which is misused today. For them, if you read the Quran, the greater jihad was the struggle within your own life and your own moral struggle to do what's right. The lesser jihad is when you try to convince other people that they should be Muslim, and it should not be through war, if possible. So Islam, once it started to spread, it would take over part of the Byzantine Empire. That's that Eastern Orthodox side of the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire. And but they would end up actually taking over most of Spain and Portugal. So if you go to Spain and visit today, there are a ton of Catholic churches, and many of them, especially the further south you go, like Toledo down to Granada, Barcelona, they're all originally Islamic mosques, but they've been transformed and made into Catholic churches when Catholicism took over. So, but much of the church, there are beautiful temples and beautiful churches all the way through Northern Africa and into the Middle East. And many of those were once Christian and then became Muslim, or were once Muslim and became Christian. So there was a lot of shifting around in that area. Now, today, the Muslim, it's not like there's a caliphate the way that this is today. Much the Middle East does have smaller regions that are ruled by Islamic leaders, but the vast majority of this spread, the pink over to the east, to the east, and then the yellow over to the west that's not Islamic necessarily anymore today. Certainly not as a region. It's not ruled by Islamic groups the way that it was at this time. But it's still Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are still all very prevalent religions today, as is Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Those are all pretty populated today. Islamic architecture, because of course you can't have idols, you can't depict people, but their design work was definitely there. So you can see the tile work that's on the outside of this domed mosque And this is actually in the Holy City. It's in Jerusalem. But then inside, the decorative work is using gold leafing and using Arabic text. For instance, down that photo on the bottom on the left, that Arabic text is in the white and it's going around in a circle. Even today, calligraphers can make, they actually have a very good trade among Islamic mosques because they want pretty designs, but most of those are written in Arabic from the Quran, from verses in the Quran. In the same way that a lot of Protestant churches today don't have a lot of inner decoration, but they might decorate the sides with banners that have quotes from the Bible. That's very typical Protestant decoration today, because most of them don't do the three-dimensional figures and stuff like that. So, but that's pretty much it. So we have covered a ton of different religions. Hopefully, if you watch this and you read the chapter, if you have questions, please put them in the journal, and I will do everything I can to answer all the questions I can. And if I think there are some that everyone would benefit from those answers, I will send them out to everybody. Thank you so much.